I've been looking very forward to talking to our next guest. I've really enjoyed talking to him many times here on the radio station as the spokesperson of the Hawks, making comments on certain issues that had come up. And then all of a sudden a book was released, and that is his story, a memoir, and it's called My Father, My Monster. And I'm talking about McIntosh Polela, a true story. So McIntosh, good morning. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me.
You know, McIntosh, I started off the show this morning and I said, it's amazing how we make assumptions about people, and I'm sure that many people have said this to you. When you see a facade, and it is quite easy to put on a facade, isn't it? And people will just judge you accordingly. But nobody really ever knows what happens behind the facade, what people have endured, the challenges that people have overcome, the wonderful things, sometimes the awful things that people have had to endure in order to get to that present state. So when I actually read this book and I found out about your story, I have to say that it was the last thing I expected from the first impression that I had made when I had, seen pictures of you, when I'd seen you on ETV, and when I'd spoken to you on the radio. Have you had that comment a lot, McIntosh?
I've heard it all the time. People have been surprised, and some people feel betrayed because, the persona that I have when I'm talking to you or talking on TV or the rest of the media is that of a person who is a crime fighter. When it comes to emotions, I'm almost always indifferent. And people formulate that persona as the complete McIntosh Polela. And as you now know, that is not true at all. I mean, I've had people that I've worked with. I was interviewed by someone at ETV that I worked with at a radio station, and she said to me, I feel betrayed because you always were very professional about your job, and you almost never talked about your private life. Well, the reason for that is that, as you now know from the book, I was never ready to talk about my life for a very long time until, very recently.
I'd love to know, McIntosh, because in this book, we go back into your youth with you. You reveal very intimate insights into the suffering that you and your sister endured. You talk about your father, and we're going to go into that in more detail. But these are people who are still around. So for you to go and expose this must have been very difficult, and you must have thought very long and hard about whether you were going to do it or not, although I believe that this has been a very important part of your healing journey. But what was the trigger? What made you decide at this stage of your life that you were going to write such a revealing book?
I had just come back from England. I think it was a year after I come back from England, where I studied for a master's degree in media and communication. The first signs that I needed to talk about my life and face my past came when I received that envelope with, a document saying that, I now had a master's degree in media and communications. I remember I worked for ETV at the time. I was sitting at my desk when the envelope was brought to me. And I didn't jump with joy now that I had achieved probably what I would never think of achieving in my wildest imagination, that I would go over to England with the life that I'd had and come back and achieve what I had achieved. And I started doing some soul searching. And repeatedly, I thought to myself, I spent my entire life running away from myself and running away from my pain. And it occurred to me that as long as I didn't face my pain head on, venture back into the abyss, I was never going to be happy. I was never going to find closure. And so for me, that was the trigger.
And have you been able to find closure, McIntosh?
No, I'm actually starting to think that closure is a myth. I was able to find some relief. And in writing about my pain and in facing it and sharing it with my sister and sharing it with ultimately South Africa, I have had some release, and I have been able to cleanse myself of my demons and, lift the weight of my shoulder that I carried for a very long time. But I haven't found closure. Instead, what I've realized is that it made it all fresh, made it all seem like it happened yesterday.
Right.
But the best thing about it was therapy for me. It was cathartic to sit down and to write about it. And every time I talk to people like you, I feel better. I mean, I feel that I'm getting cleansed. And so in some way, the healing continues for me.
I can only imagine that there's been a great outpouring of empathy, of understanding, and of love from a whole lot of people that you don't even know.
I do receive messages on Twitter and Facebook almost every single day. I mean, I get a message from a farmer from Kokstad. I got a message from someone in Belgium who had picked up the book from someone who had left it on a plane flying from South Africa.
Wow.
And all these people say to me, thank you for telling my story. And I realized while I was writing the book that I wasn't just writing my story. I was writing somebody else's story in a rural area who's still suffering what I suffered. I was writing a story of many people in South Africa and around the world who are going through what I went through. And so I received messages all the time. Empathy, not so much. I mean, I received messages from people who are telling me about their problems and saying, thank you for sharing your story.
I was at the hairdresser actually, and I was busy reading your book, and within minutes this woman came running up to me and just put her arms on my shoulder. Oh, have you read? Oh, this book is amazing. And she was just going, and she just all of a sudden started to talk about, you know, how she felt about the book and her personal issues. And I think that that's what it does. I think that it just allows people to connect with something so that they can talk about something. That was my personal experience holding your book in a public place, I must tell you, McIntosh. But let's talk about the book, My Father, My Monster, because it is a story of your life. It is a story of going back when you, at the age of 5, and you and your sister Zinhle were taken from Durban, from your family in Durban, and you were taken to the Underberg, that was Pevensey in the southern part of the Drakensberg, and you were left there with family, with relatives of your mother, and it really looks at the whole story of you growing up, how you overcome everything. And yet the title is My Father, My Monster, because you see him as the pivotal person in your life, the changes, everything that happened in your life revolves around what your father did.
It does. Look, the trigger for the life that we had, because we had a life of relative opulence, and we moved to this life of grinding poverty and of brutal abuse. And later I would find out, and as you know from the book, that for many years I didn't know that my mother was dead. I expected my mother to walk into the door and hug me and my sister and have a good explanation as to why we were left to this brutal abuse for many, many years. And now, as you know, the trigger for all my pain and the person that I felt robbed me of my childhood was my father. And another thing that happened was when I grew up, before I knew that my mother was no longer alive, I was always taunted, as I said in the book. I was told by people, you're a child of a monster and you are going to grow up to be just like him. And when I eventually met his family when I was writing my book, it was amazing to me when they described this person, and it fitted the description of a monster. And for me, it was easy to just get that title. I mean, I didn't have to think long and hard about it. My Father was My Monster was a perfect title for my book.
McIntosh, when we go back, and you've just said this contrast of your life with your mother in Durban, and with your father, and then your life there in the rural area, in the Underberg, with this family that you didn't know, and this extreme poverty. You describe the cold. You describe what it was like to endure winter. You described how you would sit and you would dream about eating the foods that you ate when you were in Durban. You would talk about Coca-Cola, and it was so vivid, those descriptions. And yet eventually, after a period of time, you became more and more used to the way of living in the rural area. But the abuse that you endured it just felt in the book, McIntosh, that it was just something, a part of everyone's life, and it was completely accepted. Why is that?
Well, look, I think as a child, you adapt very quickly. It was quite a shock for me when it first happened. And as the years went on, as the beatings continued, as the taunting continued, and as the abuse continued, you become used to these things.
Mm.
You almost accept it as a part of your upbringing. And you almost know that, some kids in the neighborhood get beat up. And you just assume that they get beat up the same way that you have to endure, and that there are extra installments of abuse. And so you accept it, and you think to yourself, maybe this is the way I'm supposed to be raised. Maybe this is the way that children are treated, here in my community, around South Africa, and probably around the world.
Mm.
It was only later when my sister was adopted by the McNamaras, and they showered us with love. And they did not abuse us, and they loved my sister and loved me as if I were their own, that I started to question why I had to be treated like that, because the contrast was so great that I realized that there had to be another way for us to be raised, and that was not the way that we were raised by that extended family.
Mm. There was one part of the book when you were so depressed, when you were so low, that you felt that there was just no reason to continue living, that life was so awful, and that you had decided that you were going to end your life. And that, indeed, for me, yes, sorry, McIntosh.
Indeed, look, the responsibility I had to look after my sister was too great for me as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that I felt that I had constantly failed her made me hate myself.
And failed her, McIntosh, because the beatings continued, because you couldn't stop the beatings. That's why you felt like you had failed her.
Because I couldn't rescue her from the beatings. Instead, I was forced to participate in abusing and humiliating her.
Mm.
And so for me, I felt every day that I was a loser, that I was a failure. And so to live was not an option. To live, well, I didn't enjoy living, so what was the point of it? And that's why I stood on a bridge over the Polela River and contemplated suicide, and almost went ahead with my decision to kill myself, until such time that I felt that I was looking and I was listening at life, until such time that it occurred to me that I was going to be betraying my vow and my commitment to look after my sister if I killed myself.
And that Polela River was very symbolic for you. But we'll come back to that because it has a lot to do with your names and the name changing, which I find very interesting as well. McIntosh, we're going to take a break. Please stay with us. We will continue talking about this fascinating, interesting, very, very emotional book, My Father, My Monster.
This is In Your Element with Niki Seberini on 101.9 IFM.
Welcome back. If you have just tuned in, I have McIntosh Polela on the line. We're talking about McIntosh's book called My Father, My Monster. And Maureen Isaacson from the Sunday Independent says, a memoir so painful it bleeds off the pages. And I think that this is not, as we were saying earlier with McIntosh, this is not just the story of McIntosh Polela. I think this is a story that many young South Africans, many South Africans can relate to. And that's why it is such an important story to be told, and it is a very important book to be read. It is important that everybody reads the story. So McIntosh, just before the break, we were talking about that pivotal moment for you when you went from a stage of not wanting to live anymore to a stage of deciding that you were going to live. Not that things changed, because, you were still a rebel. You were busy making knives and guns. You were pushed into the Inkatha party. You didn't want to be a part of them. You joined the ANC. You nearly lost your life because of it. You became an absolute outcast within your community. And once again, you were this person who was on every level abused until the McNamaras came along and wanted to be your parents and adopted your sister as well. But there was a life-changing moment for you, McIntosh, when you met Sister Van Oor. Can you tell us about that, please?